Hey everybody, welcome. I'm just, let's see, I just want to get a sense of who's here. I see people, but I think they're spread between the two tracks. Can you say hello in the chat if you're here? All right, we got people. All right, I think we've got plenty of content for this slot, so let's go ahead and get started. You ready, Matt?
Good to go.
I'm gonna share screen. Okay, so welcome. We're talking today about xAPI beyond statements. When I titled this originally, I called it the other APIs. That's a little bit of a lie because they're all part of xAPI, but they are separate endpoints if you want to get a little more technical. So there's a lot more to xAPI than the statements that we usually talk about. And today, Matt and I will be giving an introduction to those. So I'm Peter Gunther. And as Megan mentioned in the intro, I was a software engineer at TorranceLearning for a time. I'm now a data engineer at Watershed, which is a learning record store and learning analytics platform. Feel free to tweet at me. Feel free to tweet at Watershed. Matt, would you like to say a few words of intro?
Yeah, hi, I'm Matt Cleaver. Work here at TorranceLearning, learning engineering team, basically doing sort of software development and where it intersects with learning technology. And you feel free to tweet me there at MP Cleaver or at T Learning, which is TorranceLearning, or xAPI Gnome, if you want to just shout out the cohort and the party. But yeah, thanks for being here.
All right, so we wanted to start with kind of a look at what is xAPI. Megan Great gave you a great 30-second intro. I want to give more of a 5-10 minute intro now, just to talk through, when I say beyond statements, like what the heck's a statement? I know we've got people here that are very new, and you might be a little unclear on that still. So as Megan mentioned, it is the experience API. An API is a software thing that lives in the cloud, to get real technical, and it takes requests over the web. And so you can store information in it, you can pull information from it. But xAPI is specifically about experiences, not just learning, but also performance as well. So what xAPI gives you is a way to tie together how are people performing on the job, how are people performing in the real world, and how are they learning online and in person. So it's got a simple structure. A statement, again, most common way of doing something with xAPI is simply actor, verb, object. Megan threw fish, and then you've got result and you've got context. Result, hit or missed. Context at Matt Cleaver. 3 of those are required. And so the actor is who performed this action or who had this experience. The actor's identified by an email or some other kind of ID. Could be a login username. It could be something else technical that's going to really narrow down who is this person. So peter.gunther@watershedlrs.com, actor. And then the verb is, what did this actor do? There is a list of existing verbs, or you can make something up new. And so I came up with a statement like, hey, Peter presented at this conference session. And then I went looking and I did not find a good verb for presented. So again, I need an ID. I need something to say, what exactly is this verb? Pause, for instance, could mean multiple things in different contexts. Pausing e-learning is not necessarily exactly the same as pausing a video. Okay, for presented, I needed an ID for it. So you're going to see the ID. Sorry, I don't have it on this screen. You're going to see it in a couple of screens. But the verb is presented. And the object, what am I presenting? I'm presenting beyond statements, the other APIs in xAPI. And again, there's going to be an ID behind that. The other 2 parts of those 5 things I showed you before are optional. And so context is anything surrounding the experience. So here I am presenting the session at the December 2021 xAPI party on the AirMeet platform from a Windows. That's a lie, actually. I decided to do for my work Mac, but from computer X. And then the result was successful. Remains to be seen. So success and completion, TBD. We're going to assume I make it through the end of the session, hopefully successfully. Duration is planned at 45 minutes. And my score is TBD. That's one statement that can be made about this. Okay, there's a whole bunch of other statements as well. Obviously Matt Cleaver co-presented. You've got Megan Torrance, you've got Kimberly Maltzby, and so forth. They experienced, okay, so different actor, different verb. They experienced this same object, the same conference presentation with maybe a different context, okay? And then afterwards, you could say, Steve Cavello rated this conference, and then that score would be his rating. Okay, so this basic structure gives us a lot of different things we can say about a given experience. There are a few other things behind the scenes. There is a unique identifier for this particular statement. There's the timestamp, when did this occur, which is a little different from stored. When was this received by that learning record store that Megan mentioned a few minutes ago? And then there's also an authority. So where is this coming from? Sometimes I need to sort statements and say, oh, the AirMeet platform sent these statements. Degreed sent those statements. My LMS sent these statements. When I first heard about Tin Can and xAPI, they're the same thing, I was mystified. Like, what do you mean I can just store Peter Gunther presented beyond statements? Okay, that didn't make any sense to me. So I never want to talk about xAPI without giving a little tiny peek behind the scenes. Not going to have a whole lot of code today, but I want to show that there is some code behind this statement. It's not all loosey-goosey like Peter Gunther presented. Okay, it's this particular actor identified by this unique email. His name is Peter Gunther. This presented verb, as I mentioned, I went to a couple of vocabulary lists. I did not find I didn't find any presented verb. So I made a unique ID on a domain that I control so that nobody else should be conflicting with that. Okay. And then the ID, I took the liberty of assigning an ID to the December xAPI party, and specifically beyond statements. There's a plain English name, which is often just what you see with a statement. There's a little description of it, and there's a type, so this is a conference session as opposed to an e-learning course or the xAPI conference itself, the xAPI party. There's other context around this as well, but this is just a look at this. And then we have the start of results here. So, there's a score, etc. Okay, so there is code behind here nailing things down. If you have any questions, feel free, just put them in the main chat. Matt's gonna call them out for me if you have questions. So Megan also mentioned SCORM. SCORM's the predecessor, early 2000s, last spec I think was 2004. And it tracks learning data based in an LMS. It's primarily designed for e-learning courses and, and tests online and so forth. Tracks pass-fail, completion, and a few other things. xAPI gives you much richer information. It's not tied to the LMS. It doesn't have to be digital experiences. Throwing the fish, okay? Filling out a checklist. These things can be tracked with xAPI, as well as digital performance and real-world performance. And so you can take your Salesforce data and how is this person performing on the job and tie it into what did they learn, how well did they learn it. xAPI lets you track multiple scores, not just a final test like SCORM. So individual quizzes, individual interactions, and it's just richer data. Some of that richness comes from extensions. And so I gave you the required elements, I gave you a couple of the optional elements. Within those, and specifically within object, context, and result, there are extensions you can add. And they're totally freeform. So again, you need an ID. You need something specific saying, this is what I'm talking about here. So if we're tracking a video, we know that's like, where did they pause? It's this timestamp within the video, not just the time of day. Okay. We're going to see some examples. I'm going to quickly go to the xAPI vocab server, and that is the risk of using the API vocab server. It does have a tendency to be unreachable at times. But there are other published lists out there as well. But we're going to see some examples in the case study at the end. And so I'm going to leave that there for now. But I just want to make the observation, we've got several talks later in the day about xAPI profiles. A profile can provide that structure and consistency. And so what exactly does this verb mean? When do you use it? What extensions must you use with this verb to meet this set of rules for this specific kind of experience? And so it provides that kind of structure and consistency so you can really get good experience data. And then these statements get sent to a learning record store. It's basically a database of all the statements relevant to your organization or your platform. There is a conformance test to ensure that the learning record store is working properly so that you can move your data from one record store to another. And then it's, there's not a lot to a record store. It is a database. It presents these web APIs. And so different companies like Watershed and our competitors offer features to make their specific LRS more appealing. So analytics and visualization, the ability to tie in other data sets like HR data to better identify learners, and then import and export features. What can you do with the CSV? How can you get your data back out of here? So those are differences between LRSs that aren't part of that core defined performance. So if your LRS has those features, you can analyze xAPI data there. You can get various charts and reports and so forth. You can also pull them into other software. You can pull your xAPI data into Tableau and take a look at it. You can download it into Excel and look for trends or run statistics and so forth. So that's the basics of what is a statement, what is xAPI, and what can you do with it. I think the next slide is Matt's, and so I'm going to pause for a moment here and ask for any questions. I'm not seeing any, so I'm going to turn it over to now for Matt, and I will talk to you when we get to the case study.
All right, thank you. So we've been looking at xAPI statements, so that's kind of a background on how they're structured, and what they do. And if you're familiar with xAPI at all, that's the biggest thing that people think of when they think of xAPI in general is the statements. You have this record of this experience, and then when you look at them all together, you can kind of see the whole story of what went on. But there's other aspects of xAPI that we don't see as much and don't get talked about it as much, but they're actually really important and often really useful for other aspects of xAPI and how you use it. So Peter, if you want to stop sharing, I will start sharing and pick up where you left off. And hopefully that will work shortly. So the statements are a record of what has gone on. Somebody experienced something, Megan threw the fish. So you can go back and look at that statement. One thing about xAPI statements is that they are meant to be like a past record. So that's why they're kind of in past tense. Megan threw the fish. So you can kind of see what happened in the past. But we're going to take a look at the what they call the document resources in xAPI. So one thing I want to make sure that we kind of explain too about what we mean when we talk about document resources and the document APIs, as sometimes they're called, is that we're thinking of documents as being a place that holds text. So it's not a document like a Word document. So you're not storing a file. We're storing basically text. So that's what, when we're talking about the document resources, we're talking about text or JSON data formats that are being stored. But it's in a slightly different place than the statements, and they're used for different purposes. So just going to compare a little bit between statements and documents. So for statements, they're evidence for experience or event that happened at a particular time. You can go back and look at. It uses JSON, which we looked at a few minutes ago that Peter showed, and natural language display. So it's computer readable, also human readable, so you can kind of break it apart, see what's going on. It's meant to be aggregated and analyzed so that you can look at it as a whole. So you might look at one experience, or you might look at a stream of data, but then you kind of want to see, what happened. Somebody did this and this and this. That kind of gives you a whole picture. But they're also immutable, meaning they can't be changed. You can void them, but you can't go back and say, oh, I want to adjust this statement. You have to void it first, rewrite a new statement. So it's meant to be a record of something that happened. So documents, on the other hand, unstructured. So for statements, we saw the structure, the JSON structure. It has to kind of fit that structure. You can put different data in there, but it has to kind of follow a format. But the document resources are unstructured, which gives you a lot of flexibility. So with anything that's flexible, there's also, you have to maintain and monitor that. So you can't just be, it can just be anything, because you might need to pull it back in and read it in a certain way. So there's some your own internal governance, but it's not being put upon you. It's not opinionated about that structure. You're going to have to define it yourself, which is often kind of great when you want to use it for these purposes that we'll show you in a minute. So the document that is being stored can be any string, including JSON. So it can just be a string of text, or it can be JSON structured however you want to structure it. Any data structure that is valid JSON can be used. But if you do create a JSON record, you have to keep it as, you can't decide, oh, it's JSON now, I want to flip it and make it just a text string. So you kind of, once you start it with the one format, you kind of stick with that for any particular record. It's editable, so you can overwrite it completely, or you can also merge top-level fields. So if you don't want to rewrite the whole thing, you just want to rewrite this top-level field, you can rewrite that one element of it, and deletable. So you don't need it anymore, or you need to kind of reset something, or you just need to restart, you can totally delete that record. So statements on the left, that's your most common use of xAPI. You're storing what's going on at a particular time. Documents, as we'll describe the different uses, there's 3 of them, but they all have kind of these basic same structure meaning it's unstructured, you can kind of do what you want with it. That each one has certain properties that you'll need to access them, save and retrieve them, but they all have kind of this wide open, you can use them however you kind of need to. So why do they exist? So what are they for? So if you're a smaller learning record provider, so LRP is kind of an official term, used to be called activity provider. Basically, it's anyone who's sending this data. So it could be you, could be the course, could be the LMS, an LXP, learning experience provider or platform. So there's different sources that are sending this data, but you might not have a database that you have access to, or whatever platform you're using may have, they have their own internal database, but you may not have access to ways of storing data that you need to pull back later. So it can also work across platforms. So you have one that is sending this storing this data in the LRS for a particular purpose. Another platform is going to pull that same data out. As long as they know about it, it's in the LRS, and they can use it cross-platform. So kind of along the same lines, if you need to communicate information to another system, You can save that. It can be retrieved, saved somewhere else, pulled into a UI, and then different learning record providers sharing information. So how do you interact with these APIs? So just like the statement endpoint, so using these examples, every LRS has the statement endpoint. That's where you send all your statements and get them back. But they also have these other endpoints for state and these two profile endpoints. So the state resource is where you often send bookmarks, things like that. Activity profile resource and agent profile resources. So these are the three document resources, and each one of them has standard kind of HTTP, which is just the language of the web of sending data back and forth. So you can basically do the normal operations that you expect from those endpoints. So starting with the state resource, a place where you can store information about a user and an activity. So it combines these several different pieces. So to store it, you provide an activity ID. So typically, if you're like in a course, might be the course ID. It needs to be in the standard IRI form. So this example of a course, you need to provide the activity ID and a state ID, and that can just be any string. It's just when you combine the activity ID, the state ID, the agent, which is the actor who's doing it, and then the actual content that you want to store. When you combine all those together, to kind of these first three combined together kind of create that fingerprint that says this is this record. And when you want to retrieve it, you just provide those same things back and say, okay, give me the document that I stored. And again, it's any string, can be JSON or not. So you can have that structure, save it however you want, pull it back in, just need to provide these things when saving and retrieving. And then optionally, you can add a registration. So a registration is specific to a session. Typically, if it's in an LMS, it's provided by the LMS automatically. It's just a unique registration for that. Sometimes it's an attempt. You might get a reset a registration if you fail or have to re-enroll, that sort of thing. But it's basically, it can tie it to a particular session or set of activities. So how can you use state? What are some examples of ways you might use state? So maybe you can store somebody's score. They scored high on something. You can kind of keep track of a score. Bookmarks. So this is the most common use that you might see. It's typically happening behind the scenes unless you're more technically inclined and you're kind of looking behind the scenes of what's going on. But any e-learning course that has a resume function, which is pretty much all of them, is using xAPI state. So that's where it's storing bookmarks. So it's basically storing where you are on the course, how far, how many slides you got through. For something like Storyline or Captivate, it's storing variable information, like the value of some certain variables when you set them. It's storing sometimes visual state of, say, like a button. You have a visited state, a selected state. It's storing all of that in a bookmark. And for something like Storyline, it's storing it as a string. It's like an unreadable string. It's kind of a compressed state that they're using to store and retrieve basically the same data. But the same thing can be done with JSON as well. So progress, kind of along the same lines of, it could be specifically progress as you go through. It could just be as simple as slide 10, slide 11. But often they're a lot more complicated because you need to store a bunch of different types of things together. You might have settings and preferences for a particular activity. And remember that this is kind of this unique fingerprint of activity ID, the user, and then a state ID. So all this together, maybe registration. So all this together, that will be where you would store maybe those settings for just that one activity. And maybe you have some inner text somewhere that you want to repopulate somewhere else. So internally, in rapid authoring tools like Storyline, you enter text, and it saves it to a variable. You close out and relaunch the course. It pulls it back. It's using xAPI state there to pull that information in. So we're going to take a look at this example of something we built a couple of years ago for a company called NewStep. So just a little bit of background for what this project was. So they make these what they call inclusive recumbent cross trainers. It's like an exercise machine that's used for physical therapy and hospitals and gyms, and they have some home equipment as well. But they were releasing a new model called Transitt. So we're making some of this training for them. So it worked a little bit like a mini platform where people who are getting trained on this, which could be salespeople or people in a clinic, therapists, they want to get trained on this new equipment. So we have these, each of these cards is a lesson that has some information, some videos, there's a little quiz, a review quiz at the end. You could also favorite. So there's a little bit of sort of app-like functionality in here. But we didn't have a full LMS platform that we're working with. So we kind of sort of working within xAPI and the LRS and using some of these document resources. So to show kind of an example of the structure. So this is the JSON for the state for a particular user who logged in. So you can see there's some ILTs, maybe they completed some on-site training. In this case, it's not being shown on this UI, but some of this other, in the lessons structure here, you can kind of see that they've completed this one, they haven't completed this one. So all of this will be used to update this UI when they log in. And then when they make changes, they favorite something, they complete a lesson, it will get updated in the state so it can be pulled back in so they can see it. It's also sending statements, so it's sending a record of completion as well. But this way, it's all stored in this state. So when it gets pulled back up here, we don't have to query for a particular statement or set of statements. We just look at this state and say, okay, we know what their state was at this time, and this can be updated on the fly as they go through. And so this structure is something that we just defined as we were making the project. So again, totally free form, but you need to kind of have an idea of exactly how you want to do it. If you change the name of one of these properties, you're going to remember, oh, we might have an old state in there. You need to update things. So it's just keeping track of all that. So the next resource is activity profile resource. So this is structured in exactly the same way as the state resource. It can be any JSON or string, but it's a place where you can store information activity-wide. So what you need for that, you need also an activity ID, same thing. But this time we use a profile ID and then the document content. So because this activity profile isn't tied to a user or an actor, it's specifically about the activity itself. So it's kind of a similar sort of thing, but it's just used to store information about this activity. So how could you use that? You might store some metadata about that activity that can be pulled somewhere else if you need some more information. Like when you store statements, you have a name and a description, but you may not have a lot of information there about that activity. So this can store more information about that activity. You could store some high scores for a leaderboard. So maybe in that example we just looked at, maybe you could see each time somebody does something, it stores their personal state, but it also stores in the activity profile how many completions. So then when you want to pull it up in a UI, you could see a leaderboard for that activity of all the completions as people are doing them. You might store a structure and outline to be able to populate a UI or some other functionality. Again, it's all open, so you can kind of decide what you need and how you want to use this. Pieces of content that might change over time because it's editable and deletable. You might have new content that needs to be pushed in, so you can kind of push that in. So that leads to this next example, same project, the Transitt example, but this is looking at the admin dashboard view. So an admin user would go in and say, okay, where are people? What's their progress? So this might be a sales manager looking at their salespeople, how many people have gone through the training. So this is actually being stored in that activity profile for a couple reasons. So we didn't have a full database that we were storing everything in. So we were able to have our sort of mini content management system. They would add a new section. You go to publish it, it would publish it to the activity profile. And when you pulled it up here, it would give you the name of that. So we just had this simple list of IDs and titles that would populate this list. But each of these IDs you could use to query the LRS for each user's progress. And then we have another view here that you could actually dig into, specific user data or group data and things like that. But each time we would publish new content, it would update this list that would update this. So we're using it as a kind of a data store of this information for this activity. And in this case, it's multiple activities. It's like the whole program itself. It's made up of lessons. Oops, I went backwards. So the next one we want to look at is the agent profile resource. So you can probably guess it's like the other ones, it's structured the same way, but it's unique to that agent. So it's information about an actor or a person. So unlike state, is shared across activity. So because you don't need to declare an activity ID, it actually follows the person. So you provide the actor and then a profile ID, and it could be as simple as just user information, whatever you want to call that ID, just as long as it's unique and you're not clashing with something else you're storing. And then your document that you're storing. So how can you use the agent profile? You might have settings for personalization across apps. So sometimes you can store those things in state if it's unique to an activity, but you might want to have something that's broader that actually crosses all activities. So you might have somebody sets closed captioning on. They use a dark theme. They have certain volume settings in a particular thing, and then you want to use that across everything else. So when they open another project, they've got all their settings there. So that just carries across whatever you might need to. It's not one activity, it's any activity. You might have a summary of their learning, that user's learning activity. So we've used this in occasions where we didn't have a full LMS. We just wanted to have a small UI component where you could see where somebody completed different courses or lessons or many courses. You would store it in their agent profile and then show it as just a list of their completions. It's not storing it in a full system. It's just a data store that we could use to just kind of keep track of that. You might have journals in there, journal entries as they're going through something that could be stored there. You might store it in state if it's unique to an activity, but you might want it in the profile so it can be used elsewhere. They have a career learning plan that it could be pulled in or saved there to carry across. Same thing with development goals. So that leads into the next section, which Peter's going to talk about, which is going to kind of take some of these concepts that we talked about and kind of look at how they can be used all together.
All right, so my screen up here. So this is a project that doesn't exist right now, but it's still a useful thought experiment for us. Megan, I don't know if you remember when I first mentioned this to you, it was late 2018, early 2019. But I think it's a project I still hope to build someday. That's the actual punching bag that I bought to do it. It's a kickboxing trainer, and so it's kind of like DDR. If you're not familiar with DDR, it's a video game where there's music and it's timed, and you have to step on the right spot at the right time. Well, for this one, you have to punch or kick the right target at the right time. So you've got a variety of targets there, from the head down to the thigh. I'll let you fill in between. But where did this come from? What was I thinking about when I said, hey, this is something I'd like to do? These aren't really where it comes from, but these are things that have come out since that are kind of in the same space. And so I think it was last year I first saw Light Boxer. And it's okay, there's no rush to do it anymore. Somebody's beaten me to market. Not that mine was ever going to be a product, really. But if you want to spend a couple $1,000s, you can get this thing, and it's got 6 light up targets that you can punch. A little different than my idea, but same basic principle. And then just the other week, I got this ad for Blaze Pods, which are these separate buttons. They must be talking through Bluetooth. You can, it's for personal trainers and so forth. It's reflex training. You're not punching them, but can you hit the right one? How quickly can you do it? Same kind of tracking would be involved there. And this whole market, especially in pandemic, for home health, home exercise is huge. Zwift is an app that will run on your computer or your iPad and talk to your, if you have a smart exercise bike, it'll talk through Bluetooth and you can, compete. And again, it provides that kind of tracking and so forth. And then there's Tonal Gym, which uses AI to track your exercise routine and help you develop. All of these things could benefit or could use xAPI for tracking that kind of data. They all present a somewhat similar use case to this trainer, but the reality is, where did I first get this idea is I was at Dave & Buster's with my niece, and there was a Kung Fu Panda game. And those 6 pads, you punch. And it's a decent game. It's one of those games that gives you tickets. She liked it. I liked it. And I thought, man, it'd be, I could get some great exercise if I had something like that, but a little beefier at home. And so that's where this really came from. I looked into getting those buttons and just building it with that. They're like $250 a piece, just to get a replacement button. So yeah, so where does this project stand right now? I've got the heavy bag hung, and that is a punch sensor that I built a few weeks ago. And it works, it works. The multimeter tells me that, yes, I'm pressing or I'm punching this pad. It's sensing it between those conductive pads. But, it's still got a long ways to go, both in fabrication and in programming. It's still a good thought experiment for us. So let's talk about xAPI, statements and documents a little bit. So the goal is this to be an interactive trainer for both punching and kicking. A light lights up. You want to strike as quickly as possible. It can have a variety of modes and difficulty levels. So one might be random. It's lighting up all of the targets. One might be punching random. It's only the relatively high targets and random. And then there's kicking only, the lower targets and random. There might be a mode more directly like Dance Dance Revolution, where it's tied into a music track. So when I talk about modes, those are some examples. And then the use would be tracked through xAPI for a number of reasons. Track progress, to adjust the difficulty for future use to the individual user, and to analyze strengths and weaknesses. You are, it might well tell me on the left side, you don't respond as quickly. Go figure. So xAPI fits the use case very nicely. So this is the audience participation. I do have answers prepared, but I want to hear your answers first. In the chat, give me an example. The documents that Matt talked about, how could you use one of those for this system? Or, as you're using it, what kind of statements might get generated? How would you set this up? And I am a former high school teacher, so I will stand here in silence. I don't get to watch you sweat, but I will wait for answers. I could call on you, yeah. When I was visualizing this, I forgot that it was mainly chat that we'd be interacting through. So, actor Peter punched, kicked, or hit, and target ID. Yep, for sure. So that's a statement. We'll talk about a verb for that, but good call. Difficulty setting could be agent profile, could be state. Yeah. We'll talk about all those things. Yeah. Any other, what's another statement that might get sent? What's another statement? If you imagine me booting this thing up and using it. So great, forceful strike, depending on my sensors, the sensor that I'm working around can't really measure force, but if I put an accelerometer on the bottom of the bag, I could measure that. So that's definitely some part of the result that could go in there. Peter missed. Missing is an interesting thing. Missing's kind of hard to measure unless I hit the wrong target. But good thought. Launched, attempted, logged in, activated. And again, speed. Yeah, there's other, they make these smart boxing gloves now. Again, they got like the accelerometer in the boxing glove. I could, if I have my fitness tracker, if that is hooked up to the machine, I could potentially, mad about an exercise, I could potentially tie a huge amount of data into here. Response time, totally, Marla. So statements, the main ones, logged in, logged out, those are going to be important, but the main ones I'm imagining are initialized, completed, and struck. And so, I went to the list of known verbs and I found the best one for each, standard ADL for initialized and completed. And then who was it? It was JR was talking about punched or kicked. We don't really have a way, the system as I've described, we don't have a way of knowing which it was. So it's really just struck. We know this target was hit. We don't know by what. Thank you, Department of Defense. Yes, there already is an xAPI verb for hitting things. And so struck is the way to go. And then you guys hit on some of the extensions and some of the other data there. So session is akin to what Matt was talking about with registration. Over the summer, I was consulting with another e-learning company, and they raised concerns about using registration just based on how it's used in LMS. So I'm getting real paranoid about using registration now, although here it would really be appropriate. I could also do my own extension for session. Talked about mode, talked about difficulty level. So all that stuff's in the context of what did I initialize? What did I complete? What was I doing when I struck? And yeah, JR, it is proper verb choice can be a challenge. Finding, is this verb close enough? Are there maybe multiple verbs that fit? Which is the best one? But I feel good about struck. As in context around striking, as somebody mentioned, the target ID. Was it a lit? So this is the target ID target number over here. Was the target lit or not? If I punch a target that didn't light up, it's success equals false. If it's something I'm supposed to be striking, success is true. And then as Marla mentioned, response time. How much time elapsed between when the target lit and when I struck it? Okay, and I already made that point. If it was an unlit target, success is false. The other thing I might want to record is what target was I supposed to hit? What target did I hit? So that can identify, like, I'm always, I'm overlapping, I'm a little off to one side. So I'd want to record a little more context. So that's statements. Documents, sorry, we'll get to documents in a minute. The slides will be available after, so I'm not gonna linger here. But you can consult with this. And so again, I need IDs. And so I just took a domain I have control over and I created a hierarchy there for these particular extensions. These are, fairly specific to this. And so I made them under kickboxing. If something was, really difficulty level is more general, maybe I would pull that up in the hierarchy because I could use that in other projects. And then I'd have that consistency across different statements. And then response time, I can use a time value, seconds and milliseconds. But the document endpoints. So the use case is, this is going to run on a Raspberry Pi. And I don't want to run a separate database server on the device, but I want information to persist. So the next time I boot it up, it's still there. And again, I don't want to contract AWS and have a database running there. I already need an LRS to hold the statements. So I'm going to use the document endpoints as well. So I'm going to skip the question in the interest of time and just give you some highlights. And so again, state is unique to the user and the specific activity. Here, I would use each mode as the activity. And so have they completed each difficulty? Have they done random kicking on easy, medium, and hard? What is their high score in each of those difficulty levels for this mode? And then if there's any settings unique to this mode, those would get set here. They are my settings specific to this mode. And I could store some statistics for easy retrieval as well. What was my average response time on this mode? For some quick dashboards I can put up in front of the user. The activity profile is unique to the activity, but not specific to the user. And so this could have parameters for each difficulty setting. So easy, it's going to light up a new target every 5 to 10 seconds. Hard is going to light up a new target every 2 to 5 seconds. List of music tracks and URLs to tie into them. And then a leaderboard for the activity would go here. Multiple users, one activity, goes in the activity profile. Finally, the agent profile. This is unique to the actor, but regardless of activity. This one's a stretch. I think from the way I described state, I don't necessarily need to use this, at least until this profile is being shared with, my Zwift and my, tonal gym and all those other things that I don't have. But it could provide that user info. It could provide system-wide things like preferred volume. It could also have, bookmarks, favorite activities. Like I don't want to have to hit 3 buttons to get to this specific activity. My favorites are always up, and I can just hit 1 button to go to that thing that I always do. All right. So we are basically out of time. If Jamie and Megan are good with it, I'm good to stick around and answer questions for a few minutes, and Matt. Again, these slides will be available. You've got a few links to relevant information there. And feel free to email me or DM me on Twitter if you have questions. Matt, anything to add?
No, I'll be around all day here in one of the tracks or on Slack or Twitter, email. Let us know if you have any questions or comments or want to talk about more of this. And I appreciate everyone hanging around.
Okay. Jamie, I see I can either go to a table or take questions here. Which is easier for you? Do you want to get set up with the next speaker and put us at a table? Anyone who has questions? Thanks all for attending.
Yeah, so this chat is going to follow us back out to the lounge. So if you want to continue to interact with Peter and Matt, you can do so here in the chat, or you're welcome to meet with them at a table or take a quick break because we are going to start our next session at the top of the hour. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.